All right, good morning, YouTube. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing with you the pros and cons of the concurrent/conjugate system. When I first started training, I bought 3 books: Starting Strength, Practical Programming, and Naturally Enhanced. I truly believe that when it comes to the last 2 books, those are definitely in my place for mandatory reading for any natural lifter, whether your goal is size, strength, or a mix of both. Naturally Enhanced by Alex Leonidas is by far one of the best books to read if you are interested in getting bigger and stronger, and it advocates for a concurrent training methodology. So something I want to be very clear on is, what do I mean by concurrent? Because if you were to do a quick Google search, concurrent usually means training for endurance, like let's say running, jogging, or some other endeavor such as that, swimming even, and then resistance training. So whether that be bodybuilding, strength training, or something of that nature. But for the concurrent method talked about in the book, it's more so the 2 different variables of size and strength. So for this video, I am not referring to endurance and resistance training, as those are 2 completely different things, but more so in the context of naturally enhanced, where it is just size and strength, or volume and intensity training. Something I want to point out that I think gets lost in the weeds for some people who watch YouTube fitness, because there's so many different voices and they're trying to reconcile everything that every one of us has to say, is that everyone in this space has different goals. Everyone in this space has different methodologies. Everyone in this space has a different bias toward the information that they're presenting you. As a result, you need to make sure that you are aware of those differences to make sure that it fits with your own goals. I have to remind some people that if your goal is strength and one of the favorite channels you listen to is more of a hypertrophy guy, then there is a conflict of interest there, right? If you want to get stronger, intensity must go up. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. If you want to get stronger, you have to lift more weight. If you want to get bigger, intensity will go up, or it should go up, right? Something I want to make clear is that in strength training, increases in intensity is a necessary condition. It is a necessity. You cannot claim you are getting stronger if you cannot tangibly prove you are handling more load. Whereas in size training, strength increases can serve as a sufficient reason to believe you are getting bigger. It is one of those variables that you can take measurement of in addition to progress pictures or actual genuine measurements of your muscle, that give you a reason to believe that, yes, you are actually getting bigger. It's a sufficient reason to believe you're getting bigger, but it's not a necessary condition to getting bigger, right? Whereas that is not true in reverse. Concurrent training contrasts more linear or American block periodization style training, where you start with a higher volume and peak to higher intensities. Now, my biggest argument that I want to present to you here in this video is that successful training is by its very nature concurrent. Whether you use a more linear periodized approach, a more block periodized approach, or something of that nature, generally speaking, size and strength are always being developed in the background. And when I say in the background, that doesn't mean automatically. It doesn't mean without proper focus. It means that it is a constant feature of any good training program, size, strength, or the mix of both. You can't have pure phases of one or the other. At least I wouldn't recommend it. You definitely can, but I would say that's more relevant towards other sport applications other than what we like to do, which is build muscle or build size. So I will have to also define what I mean by conjugate and concurrent. Now, in this video, anything that I mention toward concurrent or I mention toward conjugate, I will kind of use those terms interchangeably, as irresponsible as that is, simply because so many of the things that I criticize in the concurrent method apply to conjugate, and so many of the people who follow a concurrent method also fall into conjugate-esque type training practices. But before I do that, I want to break down some of the successes that the concurrent system will bring you. And there are 4 basic beliefs that I definitely bought into that made me want to do this style of training, and I benefited from all 4 of these, right? To an extent, at least. 1, the main claim that people who advocate a concurrent style of training is that you do not sacrifice adaptation to volume or intensity, unlike a more linear approach. And linear is a very poorly defined term, but I will get into that later, right? So that is the first claim. You do not have to sacrifice adaptation to volume or intensity. You're always going to be able to handle high volume, and you're always going to be able to handle high intensities because you are keeping those as constants in your training. Sorry, I guess the camera is having issue finding focus, but it's okay. The most important thing here is what I'm saying. All right. The next thing that people will argue for or cite in favor of concurrent training is that linear is more productive for novices. It is that after a certain point, you're just not going to make as much gains with the linear and you need to move on to something else, and concurrent fills that role perfectly. The next point is that there is a lower risk of injury in comparison to more linear training practices. And that is due to a variation of load and also through conjugation. Conjugate and concurrent go hand in hand. I think it's fair to say that conjugate is a concurrent method, or maybe even vice versa. And finally, with the concurrent system, effort is the driver of progress. Therefore, gains are automatic. So those are the 4 basic claims that I think if you listen to someone who is preaching a concurrent system, that's what they'll kind of come down to. Like, their arguments kind of boil down to those 4 benefits. Now, concurrent training, defined as previously, when done properly, is highly effective for people who want size and strength because they're never going to be detrained from volume training, which is very relevant to bodybuilding, and intensity training, which is very relevant to strength. You have a day where you lift heavy, and you have a day where you push for more volume. You push hard to increase your performance on both of these days, using a kind of double progression on both days or something of that nature. And because you are training in different training thresholds, so you benefit from mechanical tension and metabolic stress. And some exercises are generally better with one or the other. For example, I would say that you should use the deadlift primarily for mechanical tension and not metabolic stress. Other exercises do a much better job of benefiting from volume than, let's say, a deadlift. So there's a lot of benefits here. Now, linear progression is very poorly defined, and when most people talk about linear progression, what they are saying is that linear progression is where volume is stagnant and the weight goes up. So starting strength is the best example of that. You do your 3x5 or you do your 5x5, and then you add 5 pounds every single week, right? This style of training is definitely a speed run to a plateau. But in the concurrent method, progression in intensity is dependent on improving your performance in your training volume, and that is on both days. So it's, even though one is more of a volume day and a intensity day, really that's more so a difference in the total amount of work you are doing. But essentially both days, the goal is the exact same. You're pushing hard on all of those days, going close to failure and things of that nature, right? And double progression is in fact very useful. As you inch your way towards strength, you are also adding inches to your body, right? Getting bigger, getting stronger. So it succeeds where it is trying to. And because you are training with a variety of different loads and a variety of different exercises, you are also unlikely to run into overuse injuries because you cycle through different exercises every 1 to 4 weeks. So given everything above, so long as you're pushing hard, so long as you're keeping a high standard of rep quality, and you are chasing your +1s on so many different exercises and so many different rep ranges, gains are almost mostly automatic. If you are always pushing for failure with hard exercises, so let's say 1 week it's close grip, 1 week it's your comp bench, one day it's your incline bench or something of the nature, and all of these things are slowly inching up and up and up and up, you can almost reasonably assume that because everything is going upward, you are getting bigger, you are getting stronger. But that's where the issues kind of start. So When it comes to the failures of the concurrent and conjugate system, the first being sacrifices an adaptation to volume or intensity is specific to certain exercises, but not really the entire method. What do I mean by that? So if you are starting really high volume on bench and then you taper down into really high intensity with lower volume on the bench, sure, you are going to be detrained from volume training. But is the goal to be able to maintain both of these adaptations? Or is the goal primarily one? Now, depending on your answer will depend whether or not this criticism is valid. But if your goal is to get stronger, prioritizing maintaining performance on volume work and intensity work at the detriment of improving what you can actually lift for a new 1 to 5 rep max, you are kind of having a misalignment of goals, to put it lightly. What are you really trying to aim for here? You have to be able to answer that question in order to know how to make certain decisions. Next, as I've alluded to many times, linear has been poorly defined and characterized to make it seem like it is less effective as a long-term progression scheme, despite all periodization having some element of linearity. When it comes to injury prevention, this, in my opinion, is also unfounded, as with other most strength sports. They use heavily similar movements over lengthy periods of time, and most injuries are due to poor load management rather than exercise selection. And then when effort is the driver of progress and the system you use automates success, it also automates failure. So I'm going to dive into each of these points one by one, because these are all the things that I've personally experienced as a result of following these methods for so long and then getting up to a certain point and not really having any way to move past it. So as I mentioned, sacrificing adaptation to one or the other is not always a bad thing, especially if one is actually more important than the other. The first step to serious strength training and serious strength development is the distinction between training and testing. If you are training, train. If you are testing, test. You shouldn't be so worried about maintaining both of the abilities to do either one of these things, because as a result, you're never really going to be able to put in everything you want to into one or the other. The methods are similar, but the goals are different. Train for your goals, and the method should reflect that. So what I'm using now, most recently, is a more American block periodization method, right? I start out at periods of high training volume, where I am in the, let's say, 6 to 10 rep range, or maybe 8 to 12 rep range for multiple sets. And over time, my sets and reps decrease as the weight goes up, right? However, in my training, size and strength or volume and intensity are always going to be present and developed constantly everywhere else in the program. So my dips, my curls, my tricep extensions, my supplementary presses like the overhead press or the incline, all of these things are still being pushed for volume or intensity, and they are constants in the program. So while I might be detrained on volume work on the bench press, or I might be detrained on intensity work on the bench press because I'm in a higher volume phase or at the start of earlier training blocks, that's not really a bad thing, because everywhere else in the program, I'm always maintaining a certain level of performance with volume and intensity. It's just on different exercises, so that way I get different benefits from them, right? So as I leverage the volume I accumulated for a better 1RM, the supplementary work and the accessory work is still being pushed hard, and volume and intensity is still being almost maintained and, of course, improved over time. So that drop in performance on one exercise is not really that important, because everywhere else, everything is being maintained and going up. The goal of a strength program, or the sign of a functioning strength program, is adapting to increased demands, increases in load. The goal is not to maintain different adaptations at different thresholds. What is your goal? Does your training hit that goal well? If your goal is to be, comfortable with high intensities and comfortable with high volumes, then cool. The concurrent method will do that very, very well. I found it very easy to always hit no. I could always hit my 1RM very consistently on my intensity days, and I could hit my 10 to 20 RMs on my volume days very, very well because I was doing the method for so long. But actually increasing those numbers, being able to increase the amount of weight I was lifting on either day, was becoming harder and harder as time went on. That is the point I'm trying to make here. The goal for me was not to handle volume and intensity comfortably concurrently, but to handle more intensity over time. I wanted to get stronger, and Concurrent just was not doing that for me at the time. The next point I want to really dive into is the linear is not just for novices point, right? Many people who are very strong are going to make this point and make this distinction. Linear is not just for novices. The only people who believe that are novices themselves, or people who like to think of themselves as more than a novice. Honestly, I still consider myself to be in that novice stage, or that late novice stage, even though, or maybe even intermediate, because my goals are just kind of lofty, but that's just me, right? Anyway, as any jackass on the internet will reasonably point out, and they have a fair point, is that starting strength is just a starting point, and you are not meant to stay with it forever. But there are two issues when it comes to this statement. First is that I have talked to many people, and people actually do just stay with starting strength. It's pretty rare in our space with the people who watch not only my channel, but also the other channels that are much bigger than my own that other people also watch, like GVS, Basement Bodybuilding, Natural Hypertrophy, Bald Omni Man, Steve Shaw, Faz Lifts, Sam Sheether. When it comes to the people who watch those channels, yeah, of course they've all been divorced from that. But the people who were stuck on an Athlete X program, or the people who follow and then moved on to starting strength, they stay with it. They really do. So because it's simple and it addressed a need at the time, and because it worked, they start to build this loyalty to it, and they're unwilling to make changes. And if they are willing to make changes, usually they just go from starting strength to another clone of it, whether that be Grayskull, or maybe even 531, or some other type of program, thinking that the way you progress from weak to strong is by moving from one program to another, instead of refining the program that you are currently using. If you are on a 3x5 or 5x5 program, and you get really good results from that, you're adding pounds, and then eventually it just stalls. The next thing you can do is maybe add the last set goes to technical failure or max safe reps, and then you try running that same type of program again. And when you can no longer hit 5 reps on that last one, you restart slightly heavier than last time. And then you do that again. If you keep hitting PRs, then you don't need to really change anything. You can keep maintaining that. Once you stop hitting PRs, maybe you can start adding in blocks. So instead of starting with a 5x5, maybe do a 5x7 or 5x10, or better yet, 3x10. So that way, over time, when the 3 sets is no longer enough, you can add another set. These are the changes that are more relevant to your training because they are much smaller, and you can save a lot of things for when you need them, right? If what you are doing is working, then that is what you should be doing. And then only when it stops working should you be making changes, right? So changing programs should be more so a result of changing goals. The top level lifters that I'm aware of, and I know most of these guys, they don't have like a lot of their program out there for everyone to watch and see because, they're competing to be at the top. But generally speaking, I don't even think that they really need it to be out there, because the top lifters, their programs are usually pretty consistent for long periods of time. If you watch an interview from like let's say a top lifter from, let's say, 5 years ago to right now, a lot of things have been very similar with only small changes being present. If your goal has remained the same, any method that brings you closer to that goal should be maintained or replicated until it no longer bears fruit. And when it no longer bears fruit, you don't change the whole thing. You don't plant a new tree. You just change the way you take care of it. The conditions are different, but the goal has not changed. Usually when someone says linear is only for novices, it communicates to me that they themselves are still a novice when it comes to coaching themselves. Dave Tate has a talking point that I really like, that all periodization is linear, and that's true. Our training only goes in one direction, forward and upward. No one walks into the gym, touches a barbell or a machine, and has the goal of actually decreasing what they are doing. They are always constantly refining themselves, their form and technique, but for what purpose? To over time increase demands on the body. If your concept of linear is weekly increases in load, then your concept of linear is incredibly underdeveloped. Another talking point that I really like when it comes to programming discussions is that there's really only one kind of periodization. Every sensible program that you will read, that you will write, will have some element of linearity, some element of undulating your intensities and volumes, and some amount of conjugation. How we implement linearity is the difference between different coaches, different lifters, and different goals. So some might use a rep goal system. Some might use an evolving rep range. Some might use simply doing like a more block approach, right? There's different ways that we implement linearity, where we have time frames where we assign when should we expect an increase in what we are doing. The next point that I'm going to kind of debunk, I guess, is that injury risk is more common in linear approaches, and there's a lot to unpack here. Injury risk is largely overstated in linear training, but is understated in concurrent and conjugate training. If I were to argue linear progression requires you to add load every workout, adding load every workout is mismanaging load and fatigue, which more likely leads to injury, therefore linear is more likely to cause injury, it seems valid. If A, then B, or I'll just skip over that. But like, if I'm just going to skip over that entirely. But yeah, if I have to add load every single workout, and that is a form of mismanaging load and fatigue, which is more likely to cause injury, then if any system that forces me to do that is more likely to cause injury, right? Sorry to get all over the place there. It seems valid, but what am I really saying here? If your max is 315, let's say, and you are doing sub-max work, starting out at 205 pounds, and you add 5 pounds every single week, is you adding 5 pounds every single week more likely to cause injury? I would argue no. I think your intuition would be no. The act of adding 5 pounds every single week in that scenario is not going to just magically injure you because you started at a really light starting point. But let's say your max is more around 185, and you add 5 pounds every week because that is how you got to 185. Every single week, ever since you started lifting from 135, just been adding 5 pounds every single week and keep going for that 3x5 or 5x5 or something of that nature. And once you hit your really grindy sets and everything of that nature, you're sure you're still hitting fives and everything like that, but your form has gone to shit. But you don't care because all you're doing is adding load, and you continue to add 5 pounds. Is injury more likely in that scenario? I would say yes. But is it the act of adding 5 pounds that made the injury more likely? That's where I would say no. Obviously, when we misapply anything, it becomes bad. Obviously, when we let our standards fall and decline, it becomes bad. But let's say I even do a more generous example, right? Where form is good, your rep quality is always good, things of that nature. The person who has the wherewithal to know how much work he should be doing at a certain intensity and whether or not he should be adding load is going to be much better off than the person who just blindly adds load anyway. But what is the danger here? It's not the adding load. It is the mismanagement of fatigue and load. And that can happen whether or not you add weight every week, every other week, every 3 weeks. The weekly addition of load is not the issue. It is the mismanagement of load and fatigue. So when you say linear progression requires you add load every workout, are you sure you aren't saying linear progression means you hit new PRs every workout? Because in most cases, that's what people mean. When I review programs that people send to me, when I read some of the comments in some of my other videos where they talk about linear, they usually talk about linear in that way, where they are where they're hitting a new PR every single week. And as a result, that's what happens, right? And secondly, with the premise that adding load every week is, so let me collect myself here. All right. With the premise that adding load every week is mismanaging load and fatigue, which more likely leads to injury, I have shown that adding load can be a way to mismanage load and fatigue, which leads to injury, but it doesn't mean it for sure definitely will. The best example for that are Olympic weightlifters. The movements they use are almost always the same or slight variations of each other, but the muscles are performing the same function, using the same technique that is relevant to their competition. But what is managed to reduce risk of injury is not the exercise selection, because that would remove them from practicing the skill they need for their sport, but load and fatigue. So it is not adding weight every week that causes injury. It is not, it's not that at all. It's not linearity that's the problem. It's always going to come down to how you manipulate these training variables. And exercise selection is not just a full no con solution, right? The biggest problem, the biggest flaw with the concurrent and conjugate system is that it automates failure. Just because it also automates success, it doesn't mean that it completely removes everything that could potentially go wrong. It automates those things. You have this logbook of PRs, but you can't make any valid inferences because you've operated so long on a assumption, and granted, it's a pretty fair assumption, that if A, B, and C go up, X, Y, and Z will go up too. You have collected so many different dots of data without any way to determine how to connect them. That is the pitfall I fell into. I was increasing my numbers on my incline bench, my close grip bench, my pause bench, my board press bench, my pin bench, everything of that nature, right? Everything was going up, and then sometimes the amount of return on investment I would get on the actual variation I wanted to improve would be incredibly minimal. And I didn't know what to do. Everything else was going up, so I'm just like, wait a minute, where do I even make an adjustment? And then I can't just do more bench. That's more linear. I'll be presenting myself with more risk of injury because I'm going to be using this exercise more than 1 week in a row. That was the kind of thought process I was trapped into at the time. You collect all these PRs, you have all these dots of data, and you have no way to connect them back to your goal. That is the issue I ran into. The other issue I ran into is that you are taking time away from lifts that are more relevant to your own deficiencies or have a better opportunity for growth. Even though everything was kind of going up, there wasn't enough time for me to devote to any one of these things to get it to a really respectable place where it actually has more meaningful carryover than these small mini PRs that didn't really leverage me into a better, stronger position. And the next point with that is that I never really knew precisely which exercises would have the best carryover. And because I didn't really have that data, my exercise selection was almost entirely arbitrary or entirely based on preference. And that it can be a very irresponsible way to go about things. Yes, I do think that most exercises are generally tied in terms of their effectiveness, but in the case that it's not, and the balance does definitely tip in favor of one thing, but you don't know what that one thing is, and you're constantly like fondling around in the dark trying to figure out what that thing is, you're never really giving it that time to develop to actually get you to a better point. And that is an issue if strength is the goal. And I would even argue if size is the goal too. Throughout your lifetime, you are most likely going to spend an appreciable amount of time with every single exercise variation that you can think of, or at least one that you think is worthwhile. But when you constantly cycle through them every 1 to 4 weeks, you never really keep the advantages of training one for a long period of time, and you deprive yourself from creating a need for that lift later down the line. If right now the most glaring weakness is your triceps, and you deny yourself the ability to really hammer hard exercises that are going to address that, sure, everything is well-rounded, but you're never really making big splashes in terms of where you need to progress. And as a result of you never really taking that next big step, the step above that is taken away from you. The step above that is taken away from you as well. You can't, if you, this is a weird analogy, but this is kind of what comes to my head. When you're walking up the stairs, you go step by step. You don't do a little bit of, like, you don't kind of prance around going up and down the stairs to kind of get to the final destination of the top. You know what I'm saying? So I don't know if that's a good analogy, but that's just what comes to my mind. Weird way to go about things, but whatever. So in conclusion, the concurrent / conjugate approach is in fact a great way to train. It teaches you how to work hard. It teaches you to value multiple different exercises. The one thing I really like about it is that everything in that method is you're told to push extremely hard, which is very good for size and strength. And it does produce good results. I will try my best not to completely shit on this system, just because it is definitely what got me to most of my strength up into a certain point. But when I couldn't get any further, and I felt like I exhausted the limitations of this method, I was adding more exercise variations. I was getting new bars. I was getting new pieces of equipment like slingshots and bands and things of that nature. And even then, it just was not producing the results I wanted. I just didn't know what to do, because I had all this data, no way to connect it to my goal, no way to connect it with myself. And as a result, I had very little data to go off from and improve, and I had to basically start back from zero. When you automate success, you automate failure as well. If you try to automate a system that is not fully rounded out, that's what happens, right? So that's it for this video. Has that been your experience? Have I just been misapplying this method, and as a result, I didn't see its full benefit? Because like I said earlier, so if you misapply whatever it is you do, obviously the results are going to be bad. Or is this truly an issue that is inherent with this kind of training? That's what I personally found to be in my experience, but what about you? I want to know in the comment section below. Did I just mess up, and should I give Concurrent another honest try? But other than that, I would be interested to hear in your experiences. Let me know your thoughts. I hope you are all doing incredibly well. If you would like to support me or the channel, there is a link in the description below for coaching. I would be more than happy to work with you if this has been your experience also, where I can kind of walk you through that process of trying to find a way to get stronger after you feel like whatever it is you were doing has kind of run its course. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great week. Thank you so much for your patience. The upload frequency is nowhere near what I want it to be, quite honestly. I try not to beat myself up on it all the time, but right now I'm just in my last year of university, so really trying to give my schoolwork as much of my attention as possible, because this is kind of where a lot of the classes I'm taking right now are the ones that I need to graduate. So just want to say thank you for your patience and your support during this time. The channel has been growing very slowly, but you know, it's very heartwarming to see more people watch my content, more people subscribe to the channel, and everyone has been so supportive and so nice in so many different videos and so in the comment sections, and I just really want to say thank you for that. I really am excited for when more time in my schedule opens up for me to be making more videos. There's a lot of things I'm balancing at the moment, and I will share them with you. Things have been really exciting, but just also really tiring as well. But I am excited to make more content for you in the future, so please bear with me as I finish out this year. So I'll be graduating in winter. I know that's a long time from now, but you know, as we've seen, time flies. So thank you so much for watching. I know this video was a long one, maybe a bit of a slog to go through. I was ranting a lot. I was rambling a bit. So hopefully it was worthwhile. I hope you were able to find something useful in it. I hope there is some things that you were able to take from it and think about and use for the benefit of your own training. So thank you so much. Have a good day.